who were the Johannites of the East. This was going to be my big moment, and Steve's done it. In fact, Steve's done it all down to there, where I put the mark. The first bit of my talk. Thank you, Steve. Done very nicely. I'd like to see you in this skirt, though. But yes, okay, the Johannites of the East were quite obviously the Mandaens or Mandaens. But I've been, like Steve, calling them Mandaens for ages, so I probably still call them that. If you remember what Steve said, they are this Gnostic sect from Iran, Iraq, and now Catford. And the internet, they're on the internet. They are known as St. John's Christians, well, they were known as St. John's Christians to Victorian explorers. And this was because they revered John the Baptist greatly as their great prophet, as their great teacher, well, their greatest teacher in a long line of priests. They don't, this is very important, they don't worship him as God or the Son of God or anything like that. He's their priest. And there were priests in the line that went before him and priests in the line that came after him, including women, as Steve pointed out. But being called St. John's Christians is a grave misnomer. And I have to say here that I was sitting listening to Steve talking, my heart was thudding, I was thinking, he's going to do my big finale. He's going to give my big revelation. I thought I'll throw a shoe at him or something if he does. But you didn't. No, you wouldn't, would you? No. So, better not. Anyway, why is... You would think, wouldn't you, that a group of people who revered John the Baptist so much and still do, and you know, through all their persecutions and all the attempts by proselyters from other religions to convert them, they still upheld John the Baptist. So you would think that they would be, if anything, Christians, in any sense of the word, in the usual sense of the word. But they ain't. In fact, the big revelation, which Steve didn't mention, thank you, Steve, about the Mandaens, is that they loathe and despise Jesus. Now, this is very strange, isn't it? They think John the Baptist is great. They hate Jesus. Okay, let's look at some of their words, how they describe Jesus. One of the Mandaens' holy books describes him, and you can't get much more uncompromising than this, as the lying Messiah. They also describe him, they say he perverted the words of the light and changed them to darkness and converted those who were mine, and the mine refers to John the Baptist, and perverted all the cults. Another Mandaean holy book says, do not believe him, that's Jesus, because he practices sorcery and treachery. Well, this is quite something, isn't it, for a group that have a thing about John the Baptist, to say the least. I mean, these are the Johannites of the East, the Mandaeans, the people who, as Steve pointed out, very probably at Haran in what is now southern Turkey, met the Knights Templar and passed on to them a great secret. And it was after that that the Templars became, or the inner circle of the Templars became Johannite. So quite clearly, the Mandaeans' beliefs became in some measure and in some fashion the Knights Templars' belief, or the inner circle of the Knights Templar. But they also, let's just look at some other things that they call Jesus. They call him many, many times the usurper of John's following. And they also use an interesting phrase, which I want you to remember of Jesus. They call him son of a woman. Now, you might think that means absolutely nothing, because we're all sons and daughters of women. I mean, that's just a part of the human condition. But in the Middle East, it still is a dire insult, because in cultures that don't value women, to be son of a woman means not only are you weak and ineffectual, but that you don't have a dad. You're illegitimate. You're a bastard. So to call somebody son of a woman is not a good idea if you want to, get by in Arab country. But they call Jesus this. It's the greatest insult they can muster. And I want you to remember that term, because it's very important later on. Right, well, leaving aside briefly for the moment the Mandaeans' utter loathing of Jesus, well, we've seen how Leonardo, Clive pointed out, Leonardo da Vinci had a one of the greatest thinkers of all time, had this big thing about John the Baptist and other leaders of the underground culture particularly, which is very odd, as Clive pointed out, because why would reverence for a Christian saint, become a thing become a furtive thing, a surreptitious thing, a heretical thing? And I just want you to consider this. In all the Christian martyrs that you know of, John the Baptist is almost never included. It's as if his death, his life, his message was completely separate from Jesus' mission. And you would think, wouldn't you, that if he really were what people believe him to be, the precursor of Jesus, who was somehow, very important because he was the precursor of Jesus, that he would be the first Christian martyr. But he's not. St. Stephen's the first Christian martyr. It's very interesting, and it gets much more interesting. As John the Baptist is portrayed in the New Testament, there is nothing there to reveal why Leonardo, etc., had a big thing about him. I mean, there's very little about John the Baptist in the New Testament. And he comes over, the little that there is, as being this uncompromising John Knox puritanical figure, very unappealing certainly to modern Western tastes, who comes along out of the desert and says, "Oh, you're all evil, I'm going to baptize you." And they say, "Right." And that is, that's it really. I mean, then, of course, we know that after he falls down at Jesus' feet, as if his whole life, up to that moment, was all about waiting for Jesus. And that, of course, is what we're meant to believe when we read the New Testament. We'll come to that in a moment, but it's very interesting. It's as if also we are led to believe that his mission was exclusively, John the Baptist's mission was exclusively for the Jews in Judea. We're also led to believe that Jesus concentrated on Judea. Well, they certainly did, but there is evidence, which unfortunately can't really go into now, but that both John and Jesus, to them, Judea, Palestine, the Holy Land, whatever you want to call it, was only part of a much wider mission. Certainly for John the Baptist, it was only part of a much wider mission. And that Egypt is extremely important, that we believe very strongly that there is evidence, and I'll just go into a little bit here, because I know it's very tantalizing, but it's a kind of separate subject, that there's evidence that both John, Jesus, and indeed Mary Magdalene were heavily influenced by the Isis and Osiris religion of Egypt, or perhaps even the new Hellenized, Romanized version, the religion of Serapis, who was, interestingly enough, a river god, a riverine god, whose mysteries were passed on through ritual baptism. And it was a mystery school, a dying and rising god, and a mystery school connected with baptisms. And also there are clues actually in the New Testament about the Egyptian influence. For example, the Lord's Prayer, which I'll be talking about again in another context later on, but it actually comes from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Ammon, Ammon, who art in heaven, glorious be thy name, etc. When Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are heavy laden, and I will refresh you," everybody thinks that's great. You see it on posters outside churches. But in fact, if he said it, he was quoting, because it's actually carved over a temple to Isis on the banks of the Nile. There's lots and lots of that. But as I say, unfortunately and tantalizingly, I can't really go into the Egyptian stuff at the moment. So we're kind of coming to the origins of Christianity. There is an Egyptian connection again, though. John the Baptist, as I said, his Judean mission, his River Jordan mission, was only part of a much, much wider thing. And we know from other sources, from the church fathers and letters and so on, that John the Baptist had headquarters for this huge organisation. He ran a huge organisation. And his headquarters weren't in Jerusalem. They weren't in the Holy Land at all. His headquarters were in Alexandria in Egypt, where there was a huge Jewish colony. When I said that we believe that John and Jesus and Mary Magdalene and others were part of a new push, if you like, to take the ancient Egyptian religion to the Middle Eastern lands and Mediterranean lands, we are suggesting it was a hybrid religion with much ancient Judaism attached to it because they were ethnically Jews. They weren't Egyptians, but they came from Egypt. They came out of Egypt. We asked the question early on in our research, where did John the Baptist get baptism from? Although there are cleansing rituals connected with the Essenes, for example, there are many things about John's life and Jesus' life which ruled them out from being part of the Essene community. There are cleansing rituals in Judaism, but very minor ones, but there are. But just across the border in Egypt, they conducted twice yearly baptisms as such. I mean, they actually did them with public confessions of sins and dunking and out. And at precisely the same time as John, Jesus, and Mary Magdalene and their group were pushing their message to the Jews, that coincides exactly with the only time in history that the Egyptian religion sent missionaries beyond their borders. So I just leave you all those Egyptian connections to think about, but do bear in mind, John the Baptist's headquarters in Alexandria. But back to John the Baptist as a person. Well, as I said, he seems a strangely off-putting figure. He doesn't have any star quality. There's nothing there, remotely, in the New Testament at least, to suggest why people like Leonardo should have a thing about him, why the Mandaens should think he's so great and that they even upheld their veneration for him against enemies. And certainly the Knights Templar did. Certainly the Knights Templar, against all sorts of accusations of heresy and blasphemy and so on. All right, let's really, really look at John the Baptist. We read in the New Testament, as I said, how he hails Jesus as the chosen one, falling at his feet, saying, "I'm not worthy to unlatch your sandals." And he goes on about it a bit. He does the equivalent of, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy, to such an extent that modern scholars have picked up on this. And they've said, there's a little element of protesting too much here. It's as if the writers of the Gospels are desperate to give us the impression that there was this superior-inferior thing. Jesus in the superior position, John grovelling to him. And the reason that scholars think that they're protesting too much is that now it is known that John and Jesus and their respective disciples were in fact rivals. They were bitter rivals.